Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, that made their bodies carrion, feast for the dogs and birds. So translates Robert Fagles the opening lines of Homer's Iliad. Simone Weil called the Iliad a poem of war, but it may more rightly be seen as a poem of rage. The rage of Achilles has two sources. The first is the injustice of Agamemnon's taking of Achilles' prize, Briseis. And the second source of Achilles' rage is Hector's killing of Achilles' dearest friend, Patroclus. When Patroclus falls, Achilles, as you know, launches into a rage to avenge his friend, eventually killing the Trojan hero, Hector. The Greek word for honor, timein, is derived from the root, which means to take notice of. Achilles' vengeful rage against Hector is a taking notice of the claims of friendship, fellowship, and justice. Achilles' rage thus conforms to Hannah Arendt's basic insight that rage is a reaction to injustice. As Deirdre said, there's a productive nature to rage and its connection to reason and justice. We are not enraged by an earthquake, which is tragic, but we are enraged by human decisions to bomb a hospital or enslave a people. When our sense of justice is offended, Arendt writes, we react with rage. The problem with rage is that while it is activated by justice, it rarely leads to the doing of justice. Instead, rage often degenerates into a spiral of violence. Violence, like rage, can serve justice. We shouldn't think that it doesn't. Sometimes violence does serve justice. When powerless people suffer injustice that is invisible, sometimes an act of violence can make that injustice visible in the name of justice. The problem, and thus, as Arendt says in her essay on violence, violence and rage can be rational. The problem with violence and with rage is that most often, when we turn to violence in order to make injustice visible and do justice, it doesn't lead to more justice. It leads more simply to more violence, to cycles of violence, cycles of revenge. Now, the Iliad is an exception to the Arendtian worry that rage leads to a cycle of violence. To some degree, obviously, it led to a 10-year war. There are three characters in the Iliad who are consumed by rage, and all three are described as wanting to eat raw human flesh. The first is Hera, the goddess spurned by Paris, who sets her sight on the destruction of Troy. And as David Logue liberally but brilliantly translates Hera's enraged outburst, I want Troy dead, its swimming pools and cellars filled with limbs, its race rotten beneath the rubble, oozing pus. Even at noon, the Dardanelles lit up, all that is left a blood stain by the sea. That's rage. Hera's bile and rage are such that Zeus is taken aback, and Fagles translates Zeus saying, rising in anger, Hera will not stop until she can, quote, devour Priam and Priam's sons and eat the Trojan army raw. Similarly, Hecabe, the mother of Hector, is so enraged at his death that she says she would sink her teeth into Achilles' liver and eat it raw. And Achilles, whose rage drives the Iliad, threatens to eat human flesh. When in his final battle with Hector, Hector begs him for mercy, Achilles responds and threatens to hack Hector's meat away and eat it raw. For the Greeks, this engagement with omophagi, the eating of raw flesh, threatens to threatens human civilization. It's a dangerous and unlimited rage. However, in the final scene of the Iliad, Achilles relents and accepts Priam's ransom for Hector's body. Achilles and Priam weep together. They eat together. And Achilles returns Hector's body to his father for honors and burial. As much as the Iliad is a story of rage, it is also a story of how Achilles steps back from the precipice and reestablishes human bonds. Born of a reaction to injustice, Achilles' rage, once it is controlled, offers the possibility of new bonds of humanity. There is, in other words, a rationality to rage, as Deirdre was just saying. The question of whether rage can lead to justice matters today, at this moment in our history, because rage is so prevalent in our politics. We live, as Pankaj Mishra argues, in an age of anger. Instead of experts, journalists, and civil servants who rationally produce an authoritative version of reality, we all agree upon a version of reality we all agree upon. Social media and algorithms designed to induce rage have elevated feeling, emotion, and anger and rage. Democracies are being transformed by the onslaught of viral memes that replace rational consensus with the power of feeling. For this reason, William Davies tells us we must take feelings like rage seriously as political issues. Should we, as Maisha Cherry argues, embrace rage in the struggle for justice? Or should we worry, as Frances Haugen does, that the algorithmically enhanced rage on social media is tearing us apart? And is there a way through technology, politics, or education to preserve our culture of reason against the onslaught of rage? Hannah Arendt did not know about social media, but she did experience what happens when rage overwhelms politics. While Arendt believed strongly that politics must be based on persuasion rather than violence, she was no pie-in-the-sky utopian. She took the politics of rage seriously. Writing about rage, Arendt argues that rage can be rational if and when it makes injustice visible in a way that leads to justice. She argues, however, that there are two reasons that rage will typically fail to lead to justice. First, the problem with rage in politics is that it is politically impotent, powerless. Most rage is not capable of achieving its end, since most of us are not semi-immortal heroes like Achilles. Rage in the face of inequality, racism, or oppression may indeed be motivated by a desire for justice. There is a demand on the part of the enraged to no longer endure their suffering, to be rid of inequality. The problem is that if enraged persons are not able to alleviate their suffering or rid themselves of injustice, rage can turn into despair. Faced with despair, enraged revolutionaries tend to shift their aim from alleviating suffering and doing justice to glorifying suffering as a guarantee of virtue. It became a mark of the French revolutionaries that it was a virtue to suffer. We see this today as the rage at injustice and suffering lead to an elevation of victimhood, where we celebrate those who suffer. To be a victim shows one's purity and goodness, and victimhood is a kind of virtue signaling. Many today would rather embrace their suffering as a mark of their purity than sully themselves through morally ambiguous political compromises that might actually do justice. The second reason that rage fails to do justice is because, as Arendt writes, rage most often enters politics not in response to injustice, but rather as a response to hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. Arendt's primary example of hypocrisy and how it fuels rage is the terror during the French Revolution. Robespierre and the revolutionaries began the revolution fighting for freedom. But as the revolution progressed, they came to embrace the cause of the French people, the suffering French people. But the revolutionaries were mostly educated, middle class, bourgeois, and upper class. They embraced the poor, she says, not not as poor people fighting for their justice, but out of compassion. Robespierre and his fellow revolutionaries knew that while they claimed to fight for equality, they were wedded to their privileges. Thus, progress towards justice was not only hard and impossible even, and so as a way of compensating for their impossibility of their claim for justice, they sought to prove themselves not by accomplishing justice, but by showing themselves to be more morally virtuous than others. And because they distrusted their own selves and saw themselves as hypocrites, they also sought out hypocrisy in others. They picked up on any backsliding, any hesitation, to attack as hypocrites those who spoke of social justice and equality, but secretly showed a lack of total commitment. Everybody became suspicious. The charge of hypocrisy is such that no one can escape it. We all have complicated and impure motives, so the demand for purity of mind sets an impossible standard. As Arendt writes, the demand that everybody display in public his or her innermost motivation, since it is actually a demand that is impossible to meet, transforms all actors into hypocrites. The moment the display of motives begins, hypocrisy begins to poison all human relations. Once Robespierre and the French revolutionaries equated virtue with the qualities of a pure heart, suddenly they saw intrigue and calumny, treachery and hypocrisy everywhere. The revolution began not to fight for the poor, but for the purity of virtue. And since, of course, no one is virtuous, it began to be a terror attack on everyone. Instead of aiming at the productive doing of justice, alleviating poverty and hunger, guaranteeing security and equality, the rage against hypocrisy leads to the destructive terror that enforces virtue. All those who seek to act in public come under the suspicion of hypocrisy and are subjected to terror and the guillotine. Arendt's reflections on hypocrisy, I think, are very relevant for today's politics of rage. Rage drives the Trump movement, for whom hypocrisy of elites, left elites, and even some right-wing elites, is proof that government, universities, scientists, and civil servants are not the public servants and impartial experts they claim to be. The rage of the Trump voter is driven less by a claim of justice. It is unclear what actual interests the MAGA movement represents, than a resentful fury at hypocritical elites who would integrate public schools while sending their own children to elite private schools, defund the police while hiring private security guards for their homes and communities, and welcome undocumented workers and hire them to work in their homes without paying fair wage or health care benefits. What enrages these Trump voters is the sanctimony of elites who preach white fragility as they jet around the world in moneyed cocoons of light-thinking cosmopolitans listening to podcasts about social justice. Rage and hypocrisy is not only a phenomenon of the right. The enraged left, many of whom suffer from Trump derangement syndrome, play much the same game. The left is furious at those of us who dare to aim to solve problems of education by creating charter schools or teaching phonics because they violate abstract tenets of equality. Free speech advocates are elites who have the power to control speech. What enrages the left is often not the right, but those fellow travelers on the left who dare to express heterodox opinions or seek practical solutions. Above all, the left today is agog at Trump's hypocrisy, his ability to parade as a truth teller and advocate for the working man, while he lies like an addict and hosts those who kiss his feet at Mar-a-Lago resorts. Trump is a full-on hypocrite, rotten to the core. His hypocrisy is so blatant that it is almost a trap. Because Trump has no shame and embraces his hypocrisy, attacking him as a hypocrite has no power. Arendt asks the question, a question I think we all could learn from. Why is hypocrisy, historically considered a minor vice, suddenly the chief vice of our rage-infused modern politics? She traces the problem to Machiavelli's counsel, appear as you may wish to be, which she glosses to say that what Machiavelli really meant is, never mind how you are. This is of no relevance in the world and in politics, where only appearance, not true beings, count. Appear as you may wish to be. Machiavelli's advice is the counsel of the hypocrite. There is no true being. There is only lies and fabrication. That I am untrue to myself matters not at all, because there is no true self to which I might be true. Amongst hypocrites, the charge of corruption fails, because the whole world is corrupt. That is Trump's great insight. The real crime the hypocrite commits is to manifest the horrifying fact that not only is he rotten to the core, but so is the world rotten to the core. As Arendt writes, hypocrisy is the vice through which corruption becomes manifest. Hypocrisy is the vice through which corruption becomes manifest. The danger of hypocrisy and the reason it engenders such rage today is that it is the only vice that is impervious to the demand to act virtue, and it reminds us of our implication in our corruption. That's why we hate it so much. In a world that is fully rotten, we turn our rage from an impossible justice to the rage against hypocrisy, first out of despair, because actually making the world just is difficult, if not impossible. We transform our rage at injustice into our rage against hypocrisy, because exposing hypocrites is actually something we can accomplish. In exposing the hypocrite, we congratulate ourselves on our own virtue, even as we show the hollowness of all claims to virtue, including our own. This conference on rage and reason is born from the worry that our enraged politics today is so consumed with a rage against hypocrisy that not only will it divert us from the urgent needs of working for justice, but also it will tear down the last vestiges of our political institutions dedicated to a government by nonpartisan, rational, and public-minded citizens. As Arendt writes, to tear the mask of hypocrisy from the face of the enemy, to unmask the enemy and their devious machinations and manipulations that permit them to rule without using violent means, that is to provoke action, even at the risk of annihilation, so that the truth may come out. To provoke action even at the risk of annihilation. She says these are still among the strongest motives of today's violence on the campuses and in the streets, writing in the 1960s. While hypocrisy is undoubtedly a mark of corruption and a lack of integrity, the rage against hypocrites forgets that politics has always been practiced by imperfect people pursuing power and interests. If hypocrisy is the compliment vice pays to virtue, it means that the hypocrite at least must give some lip service to being virtuous, and that actually keeps the ideal of virtue alive in the world. There is some rationality to hypocrisy and some goodness to it. At least the hypocrite says they need to try and be virtuous, and thus they must do some things virtuous. The rage against hypocrisy tears down all institutions and all those who would dare to engage the problem. It leads to cynicism and nihilism. And from out of hypocrisy arises a demagogue, a speaker for the people who attacks the corrupt and hypocritical political world, the man-made and artificial laws that are now seen as pale imitations of natural laws. The only thing the people now believe in is naked self-interest, free from hypocrisy. Yes, politics has always been about power, and truth has always had an uneasy relationship with politics. It was one thing when, during the French Revolution, the revolutionary leaders tore each other apart looking for hypocrites. But today, amidst a social media landscape in which everyone has become a public actor, the terror has spread to the entirety of the population. We are all political. We are all hypocrites. And we are all in fear of being called a hypocrite. What can we do about this situation? How can we save our democracy and our public culture of reason and persuasion in the age of anger and rage? That is the question that I've asked the speakers who are going to join us over the next 2 days to address. It is, I think, a pressing question, and I'm very excited to hear their answers and your all engagements in it.